Our reading today offers a brief history of the Highlander Center and is adapted from their own source materials. In 1932, the Highlander Folk School was founded in Mount Eagle, Tennessee. They focused first on organizing with both employed and unemployed working people. By the late 1930s, Highlander was training union organizers and leaders in 11 southern states. During this period, Highlander also fought segregation in the labor movement, holding its first integrated workshop in 1944. Highlander's commitment to ending segregation made it a critical incubator of the civil rights movement. Workshops and training sessions at Highlander helped lay the groundwork for many of the movement's most important initiatives, including the Montgomery bus boycott, the citizenship schools, and the founding of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. In 1961, after years of harassment and several government investigations, the state of Tennessee revoked Highlander's charter and seized its land and buildings. But the school reopened the next day as the Highlander Research and Education Center, and from 1961 to 1971, it was based in Knoxville. And in 1972, it moved to its current location near New Market, Tennessee. In the late 1960s and 70s, Highlander was central to organizing in Appalachia, supporting anti-strip mining and worker health and safety, among other efforts. In the 1980s and 90s, Highlander expanded its work to support grassroots groups fighting pollution and toxic dumping, and supported emerging anti-globalization movement by sponsoring workshops and forging connections with international organizers. Today, Highlander continues to fight for justice and equality by supporting and organizing among Latino immigrants and young people, and helping organizations with diverse constituencies to develop new strategies and alliances. Highlander prioritizes programming for leadership development, strategic efforts to develop tools to advance multiracial intergenerational movements for justice in our southern region, and support organizations from the Deep South, Appalachia, and immigrant communities. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, is heavily associated with the civil rights movement and was founded while its emerging members were gathering at Highlander. A few months before she refused to give up her seat on the bus, Rosa Parks was at a training at Highlander, and these moments did not spring from nowhere. Sometimes the best moments of our history in our nation had some seed at Highlander. Though Highlander has been involved in a lot of different justice work, they did this while staying true to their mission, being a place for folks to gather and learn together, a place to support and grow justice that's needed in our world. They knew who they were and why they were there, and were able to thrive despite being targeted and closed. And they were able to adapt and change with the times.
Eleanor Roosevelt, at the age of 74, risked persecution by the KKK, drove at midnight through the hills of Tennessee with that pistol in between her and the 71-year-old woman who picked her up from the airport. Yeah, if you wanted to clap, that's appropriate. She faced this persecution for speaking at a workshop at the Highlander Center. Education can create power. Gathering people together to work for justice creates power. This is known, and it scares some people. And it sometimes can create a target. Now, former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was, of course, at greater risk of intentional violence, a literal bounty on her life, because of her notoriety and role. And her destination that night of the Highlander Center, who Mia told us about in our reading this morning, has for a long time been targeted because of its often background role in movement work. During the civil rights era, we heard individual citizens, militias, as well as local police and government, all directly attacked and monitored the center. We'll soon hear the story of Septima Clark, a Black teacher employed by Highlander, who was among several employees forcibly arrested for possessing alcohol she did not, in fact, possess. The charges were later dropped, but they did spend a night in jail. Most recently, Highlander experienced an arson attack by white supremacists in 2019. No people were harmed, but incredibly valuable archives that center held and a historic building were destroyed. The Highlander Center is viewed as dangerous because of the education and organizing support they provide to many movements of justice in our region and across our history. And it's important to note that these did not stop Highlander from being Highlander, from doing the work they were called to do. When red baiting, when persecution for being called communist moved the courts to disband their institution, they opened the next day under a new name. After the arson attack in 2019, they raised money from their many supporters and improved their facilities. They stayed true to their mission, took precautions to keep their people as safe as possible, and carried on doing the work they believed to be essential and life-saving, because it was and is. Now, to be very clear about a reality, Unitarian Universalism as a whole, as a national and international movement, as well as locally and regionally, does not have the same target as the Highlander Center, because we do not, in all honesty, have the same mission or impact, right? We've had some powerful moments we've been a part of in history, but we've not been the seeding ground for countless movements for justice and the education and training ground that made these movements so successful. So, I am not suggesting that we should, or even that we could, make such an impact that would put us at such a great risk as the stories we hear today. And today, of all days, it is important for us to name that we are a quite openly and proudly liberal religious institution that works for peace and justice, and we'd like to do some more of the work for justice part, right? Well, have no fear, I suppose there will be plenty of opportunity to do that work in the near future. I do not need to tell you that beginning tomorrow, we are once again going to have a fascist leader of our country who enters into office even more emboldened and with even more horrifying plans that will hurt our neighbors who are most marginalized, and that will embolden too many other neighbors to act and speak with vitriolic hate. The next 4 years, many who know more about politics than me have written, are going to be more difficult than his 4 before. And so it is important for us to be wide-eyed about the response that could come amidst a likely increasingly fascist leader. And that is why we take a moment now to be inspired by the risks, the huge risks others have taken for love and justice, and to consider for ourselves what risks we might be willing to take. We will each need to do this individually, and we will need to do it together collectively. We need to ask, what are our values, and what are we willing to do for them, to risk for them, and what are we not? And it is okay to confess that there are things that we cannot risk. I was willing to take more risks 10 years ago than I can now with a very little being in my direct care. right? We all have a lot of factors to be considering when assessing the risks that we can responsibly and realistically be taking. And I think it's important for those of us who have privileges of any variety to interrogate the why of why we're not willing to risk something. We also need to acknowledge that many of us take risks just by existing or stepping outside of our doors, and that this affects the additional risks we can realistically take for our sense of health and real physical safety. Now, I think we have a commitment here that I hope we can make good on, that this fellowship, this space, can be a place of increased safety for those who experience regular harm and persecution, marginalization outside of these doors, right? To reach this commitment, we of course need all of us, and if you're like me, all of us could use a little inspiration right now, right? And so the day before the inauguration and the day before Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we look to another story that intersected with the Highlander Institute. Another story to ground us and give us inspiration for the next 4 years. And because I perpetually have a cold with a toddler, I need a sip of water. Septima Clark was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1898. Her father had been enslaved, and her mother, though from South Carolina, had been living in Haiti when she met her husband. Septima Clark experienced her whole life discriminations in schools. First, as a child whose parents were just trying to get her a good education, then as a teacher, which she became only through long hours of work in school when she was allowed to go to them. And so she often taught adults in the evening, developing an extraordinary literacy program that enabled adults to gain reading and writing skills through the use of regular, always around materials, even Sears catalogs. Can anyone imagine like an old Sears catalog? I can't, but some of you can. Even Sears you don't need to out yourself, it's okay. Even Sears catalogs became teaching tools for Clark. In 1956, when Clark was a public school teacher in her home of Charleston, South Carolina, as well as vice president for the NAACP chapter, a law was passed in Charleston, South Carolina, that no city or state employee could be involved in civil rights work. 1956. Clark refused to give up this work and not only lost her job, but her pension after 40 years of employment. Shortly thereafter, however, she attended a workshop at Highlander and was quickly hired to be their director of workshops. Now here she further developed those adult literacy classes that she had started years ago, and they became known as citizenship schools. These classes fostered community building and pride of self and culture, as well as the rights all of us have as citizens. And of course, they were literacy schools teaching reading and writing. Now, these schools were crucial because literacy tests were being used in many southern states to prevent Black people from being able to vote. Enter Septima Clark and other leaders she'd gathered around her who create a citizen school and citizenship, that is a hard word to say a lot of times, citizenship school, and then train over 10,000 teachers. The African American Intellectual History Society estimates that Clark's citizenship schools were no small part of the 2 million person increase of registered Black voters from 1955 to 1970. 2 million people. Now, Now, certainly some law changes helped too, but we know that if people don't know about a law being changed and do not feel safe and empowered and supported by community to go and do a thing, we're probably not going to do the thing, right? And 10,000 teachers trained is a huge number. If each teacher only taught 25 other people and didn't train any other teachers, that would be 250,000 people right there who we can say with fair amount of certainty were registered to vote just because of these citizenship schools. It all started with an education program that Clark started when she was teaching nights. It started and continued to meet in the back rooms of beauty parlors and barbershops, places where people could gather safely together. Now, these classes became a program when Clark was at Highlander, and then the program became so large that it needed a new home. Highlander's budget just wasn't big enough to support it. And all were pleased and proud when it moved to Reverend Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and Septima Clark joined their staff and executive board. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. referred to Clark as the mother of the movement. The educational methods and classes she created and dispersed across our nation are what enabled, in so many ways, the civil rights movement to be successful. When Clark lost her job in Charleston for refusing to sacrifice her values and work for civil rights, another door opened. One that enabled her to have difficult to quantify but incredibly powerful impacts on our entire nation. One that enabled her to truly change our nation. And a fun ending to our story is that Septima Clark wound up serving on the school board in her home of Charleston, South Carolina, that had previously fired her. Not only was she elected to their school board, they reinstated her pension. Sometimes the risks and harms that come our way are righted in the future. Sometimes the doors that open when one closes are more grand and powerful than we could imagine. And sometimes doing the right thing is just doing the right thing. And living into our values means not losing ourselves to fear, means not losing ourselves or our way of living. We can, when we know our values and are clear about our gifts, skills, and capacity, make a tremendous difference. So let the story of Septima Clark, let the story of the Highlander Center be ground and inspiration. May they fortify and guide us. And on the eve of an election and the eve of a day of celebrating and honoring a great figure of our history, may we be so bold and brave enough to ask ourselves the hard questions of what our deepest values are and what we might be willing to risk to see them come into life. Amen. May it be so, and may we all make it so.